China. Like with all units in world history, we're starting with the deep ancient past, the civilization that creates the foundation, the nucleus for all other civilizations that come out of this region. We will talk about other societies and cultures in East Asia, but we're going to begin with traditional Chinese civilization because um, it creates such a foundation in terms of politics, in terms of economics, in terms of culture, and so much else. And we will revisit other elements of it and trace it up through the modern day, up to modern China and the dynamic society that has become. So we're going to look at traditional China, particularly today, in the areas of geography and politics, political system. Its geographic origins are in that it's over 4,000 years old. It's as old as anything you're going to see in Mesopotamia, in the Indus, in Egypt to some degree, although Egypt was right about concurrent with most of this. What's unique about China, though, is it develops in a very peculiar form of geographic isolation. What I mean by this is that geographic features surround the civilization that emerged, that kept out really influence of outside groups. Mesopotamia had to contend with other civilizations, other people. They, of course, knew about Egypt. Egypt knew about Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was aware and trading with the Indus. China, far removed from that. So here's what I mean. Geography-wise, if you look at this map, early Chinese civilization develops in two river valleys. One is called the Huanghe River Valley, or the Yellow River as it's been anglicized, and the Yangtze River Valley. Both of these eventually get unified under various Chinese empires. But here are the geographic features that kept them isolated. You have the entire Himalayan mountain range to the southwest. Not a whole lot of people are getting across that. You had the Pacific Ocean to the far east. Nobody's getting across that, at least not yet. And you had the Gobi Desert to the north, other deserts in Central Asia as well. So you have this protective shell that encompasses all of East Asia, that North China plain, river valleys, and so forth that give birth to this powerful civilization. Also, it's protected. And that's a key element to consider. Those locations, the Gobi Desert, the Himalayan mountains, and the Pacific Ocean. So the two river valleys, the first of which is called the Huanghe River Valley, the Yellow River, as it's more commonly known, and the Yangtze later on. They support, just like all river valley civilizations do, vast peasant populations. Peasants that, over time, cultivate land and grow crops on a scale that outstrips most other civilizations. When you compare what emerges in China, in particularly northern China, but also in southern China, the population that is sustained in that part of the world is much bigger than what you're going to see in the Indus, in Mesopotamia, even in Egypt. As powerful and as productive as the Nile River Delta is, China at its peak is going to sustain the vast majority of these early populations. So how are they doing it? Well, they start cultivating an early type of grain known as millet, common forms of wheat as well. This is more in northern China. In the south, particularly in the Yangtze River Valley, that's where you're going to see rice production go into overdrive. And over time, the Chinese are going to become extremely skilled at rice production on a vast scale, which is going to feed, population centers of hundreds of millions by the first and several centuries CE. They maximize food production. One of the things that they're going to figure out how to do in the Huanghe River Valley is carve into mountainsides. And also in the south, they're going to do it as well. And hillsides, what's called terrace farming, where you're maximizing every bit of space you have. Chinese emperors and nobility are going to insist upon this. So the productivity is going to just really surge in this part of the world. I want to start here with a brief little text analysis. You're going to be jotting down a summary sentence based on what you read, or what I read, and you hear. And you can follow along. Mrs. Clark's going to be calling out some names, or you're welcome, of course, always to volunteer. This is a description of farming in ancient China. The rich soil and the abundant water in the Huanghe Valley aided the growing of crops. The farmers raised, in particular, two types of grains, millet and wheat. To protect their fields from flooding, the Huanghe farmers built dikes. These earth mounds kept the river within its banks. The farmers also dug irrigation canals to carry water to the fields in dry weather. One of the reasons for the rise of government in the Huanghe Valley was the need for an organized way of regulating the dike and canal systems. So here's what I'd like you to do. There's several ideas here. Can you merge those together in one summary sentence over the next minute and a half or so? Don't just do a word salad of stuff you see and combine it into something. You can use your own words. What's it basically trying to convey? What are the several main ideas? Be writing this down in your notes. Brief summary sentence. We're not moving mountains here. Mrs. Clark, who do we got? Oh, yeah, volunteers. Always start with volunteers. Who wants to? Go ahead, CJ. Thank you. Okay, they both did irrigation. Sure. There's some other ideas we can merge here in our summary sentences. Any other volunteers? All right. We resort to the draft. Grace.
I said it's kind of like how the reason why the government existed is because of the farming and how that's a huge part of it. You know, the systems and the canals.
Government exists because of farming. Yeah, that's a key secondary idea. It's not just the story of agricultural. That's a big part of this first part, but that it's out of agriculture that government emerges. Agriculture stimulates the need for a government. If you think about it, agriculture on a mass scale is complicated. For one thing, irrigation projects, the capturing and directing of water for the purpose of growing crops. This requires mass construction of canals. You need to mobilize hundreds, thousands of people to get that done and to regulate the usage. What if somebody takes more water than somebody else? So all of these raise questions that governments eventually have to come into formation to answer. It's the oldest, one of the oldest recorded civilization. And the Chinese civilization, by comparison, is going to be much more consistent and deeper in terms of how it keeps its records when you compare it to Mesopotamia or elsewhere. The river, as I said in the summary sentence, stimulates early governments and empires. Two concepts that I want to familiarize you with that relate to China and the first civilizations that come out of this, and especially the political systems that come out of this. The Middle Kingdom. This is a name for how China saw its early self, and it really will carry throughout Chinese history, and it will be in many ways how Chinese political leaders think about themselves, especially going back to ancient times, which is that this civilization that emerges in these river valleys, that's shelled behind these mountains and deserts, it sees itself as the most dominant, the most productive, having the most luxury goods, having the most desirous things of all kinds. And that sense of calling yourself the Middle Kingdom is in many ways an exclusionary concept. The idea that you are the center. The Chinese character for itself means center. That other people are at the periphery. Other people are barbarous and not as civilized and cultivated
as your kingdom is. And by comparison, at the time, China really could see itself that way. This is a view to kind of help you think about that. That concept of the Middle Kingdom is very exclusionary. It's the idea that barbarians are elsewhere, but they are in fact the center. A concept that kind of grows out of this idea of the Middle Kingdom is what's called ethnocentrism. It means to judge other cultures by the standards of your own. If you start with the premise, the assumption that what you have is the best, what you have is the most desirous, you will create metrics to measure other cultures basically by just simply applying your own. And it's this very early success and power found in early Chinese civilization that fuels some of that. So that idea of Middle Kingdom is closely linked with this idea of ethnocentrism. So let's look at the political system of ancient China. Once the civilization gets going, and you can grow crops, and you can have irrigation and early forms of government, how does it look? Well, Chinese civilization in general tends to be ruled through an emperor system. The emperor is at the top. And one thing I will mention about this is that a Chinese emperor wields power that in many ways dwarfs, makes it look very minimal, the other kings and emperors of other parts of the world. I mean, the Roman Empire at its peak, the Caesars at their peak probably ruled quite a bit of territory, what a lot of the Chinese emperors did. But if you think back to the kingdoms of Europe, of Louis XIV's France or Henry VIII's England or some of the others, they were really small by comparison. Tiny kingdoms that didn't have nearly the amount of resources. A Chinese emperor, even going back to the 3rd, 4th, 5th century BCE, is going to wield far more. So keep in mind that it's a system that has an emperor at the top and it rules through a system of nobility. More on that in a second. One of the justifications or concepts I want you to be familiar with for how an emperor rules and how others see the emperor's power is this concept called the mandate of heaven. This is a concept in Chinese history which is a justification for one's right to rule. And it basically says this: if you're in charge, if you're the emperor and your dynasty is in control, if your ruling family is in control, it is in control because the heavens desire you to be in control. And if you start to lose power, if your control starts to fray and weaken, it's a sign that you've lost this mandate of heaven. And this is first used in Chinese history when the Shang dynasty, more on them in a second, but they're one of the first to unify China as an empire. When they begin to fail and collapse, the new upcoming Zhou dynasty, the new set of rulers, they will call upon this idea of the mandate of heaven. They'll say, we're justified because the existing old dynasty is failing to rule. And another concept that's part and parcel to the mandate of heaven is that Chinese history is replete with what is called the dynastic cycle. Up and down, like a wave, multiple waves and currents. Rise, recovery, peak, and fall of new ruling groups. And I want to just show you a zoomed in image of what the dynastic cycle means. Every dynasty starts out new and fresh, ambitious young rulers who take power oftentimes through military means. They bring peace, they rebuild infrastructure, they have grand construction projects, they give land or redistribute land to peasant populations, they protect the people. Generations go by, and that new dynasty is no longer new. They become the old dynasty. The old dynasty is maybe set in its ways, it's complacent, it taxes its people too much, it stops protecting the people, it stops fulfilling its obligation to peasant populations, or maybe it treats them unfairly, brutalizes them, and oppresses them in many ways. And this old dynasty, as its power begins to fray, and people can see that, it starts to experience problems. So that means every time you'll see like a flood or an earthquake or a peasant revolt or invaders or banditry in the countryside, it means that the people are connecting it back to that mandate of heaven concept. And they're going to start to think, we've got problems. Society isn't what it used to be. Maybe that ruling family, that dynasty has lost the mandate of heaven. And it's usually out of this that a new dynasty will emerge. So there's this idea of sort of birth, decay, and renewal. That characterizes much of Chinese history, pretty consistently. In terms of how the rule took shape, much of early China is ruled in a feudal system that a lot of historians and anthropologists have compared to that of feudalism in Europe. And I just want to remind you of what that concept means. Feudalism means a system of exchange, land for service. And in most of world history, land for service meant this. I give you land to work, and in exchange I give you protection. Or I give you protection, you work the land that I give you. That's the obligation that was between peasant populations who needed food and they needed protection, and emperors who wanted production and were willing to give protection through armies. So that system of feudal rule, with the emperor at the top, nobles dispensing land, giving it out to people, and large peasant populations who worked the land. That's how it kind of worked. I'm going to read you another excerpt here. Last summary sentence that we're going to need to generate here. But this is a little bit wordier, so I want you to use your own words. Don't just kind of reconstitute like a handful of words you see. Tell me what's really going on in this paragraph. Taxation and land in ancient China. This is sort of Chinese civilization in the ancient world in action. There were two kinds of tax. The military levy, another word for tax, and the production tax. The production tax concerned the 1/10 of a total family's grain production, which was the product of its share of the public field, and also taxes on the crafted goods sold by the artisans, merchant profits, and any fishing or forestry incomes of lands managed by wardens. The military levy was used to supply the armies with carts and carriages, horses, armor, and arms, as well as including quotas for their infantry service, meaning young men in various villages and towns had to serve a quota for military service. It's like the equivalent of a draft. These taxes fully provided for the expenses of the state treasury and 7 arsenals, and the gifts and grants that were bestowed by the state. The production tax was used to provide for the sacrifices to heaven and to the earth, for the royal clan sacrifices, and for service to all the many spirits. It supplied the needs of the household of the Son of Heaven, for the salaries and sustenance of the state officials, and for the miscellaneous state expenses. Take a couple minutes. Try to convert that to a summary sentence. What's the main idea here? Think about power, land use, taxation. Describe what we just heard. Do we have any volunteers? No volunteers? Guess we're going to a draft again.
Caleb.
Okay? So the idea of two different types of taxes, all right? One more.
Abby,
Abby, where are you? Yeah.
I said taxation could be either a positive or negative aspect of someone's life depending on the power or loss of them.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a fair summary. Using your own words, I mean, you didn't delineate the two types, but you didn't need to, and that is the idea is that taxation could be really productive, that it could empower you to have access to various services like the protection of the military or religious purposes. So I kind of like that angle. Moving on, Mrs. Clark's going to talk about this on Tuesday, and that is the Chinese social system. But I wanted to point out this image to you, and we will return to it. Yes, the emperor is at the top, and yes, the emperor, like all emperors, has entourages and support systems of military and bureaucracy, and that's the kind of first class of Chinese society. But interestingly, in China, peasant populations represent the second class of society, above that of artisan or craftspeople, merchants, and slaves. And this is a little bit in reversal to what we see in much of Europe or the Middle East or even other parts of Asia, is that peasants traditionally are at the lowest ends of society. But in China, they have much more social value and weight. Last note slide here, and you don't need to memorize these dynasties, but I wanted to give you some names to pair with how early Chinese civilization develops. I start with what's called the Xia, which around 2100 to 1800 CE, right as Indus civilization is just getting off the ground, the same kind of thing is happening along the Huanghe Valley in China, which is clusters of agricultural settlements are becoming unified, and their production is coming under one central leadership. There are limited records for this, but there is some archaeological record that they have that there was an element of political and social unity in the Yellow River Valley and northern Chinese plain at this time. This is sort of the first example of a civilization coming together on a mass scale. The Shang dynasty kind of has the distinction of being China's first real empire that manages to pass its kind of lineage on for several generations, more than several generations, several hundred years. Around 1700 BCE to about 1000 BCE, you see cities and settlements all throughout the North China Plain and Yellow River Valley get unified. This is as big as anything, actually bigger than anything you're going to see in Mesopotamia. It's like twice the territory of the Fertile Crescent thereabouts, and you're going to see cities crop up here. This is, the heart of the Bronze Age, so you're going to see bronze weapons and swords and arrows and all other sorts of military weapons emerge during this time, as well as bureaucracies. The emperors are going to be able to have administration to go out and collect taxes and keep records and write histories and do all of those things to support their rule, and writing systems. The Shang are not going to last forever, and this is where that mandate of heaven and dynastic cycle comes into play, is that the Shang eventually decay. They eventually are overthrown by a new dynasty known as the Zhou. The Zhou dynasty are going to peak from about 1000 into 300s and 200s BCE. The Zhou have a distinction of having kind of they slowly burn out. They always had a sort of decentralized rule, and the last several hundred years of the Zhou are a really tumultuous time of lots of war making, lots of fighting, lots of questioning of the existing political rule. They make some agricultural advancements during the time of the Zhou. This is where you get the iron plow, which is really important to agriculture. It allows you to till up a lot more soil. It allows you to bring a lot more land under cultivation. It's also under the Zhou that you see the emergence of what's called Confucianism. This is something we're going to talk about Tuesday, but also we're going to spend a lab talking about Thursday. This is a foundational philosophical concept that anchors much of East Asian society, and particularly in China, that emerges during the Zhou dynasty. It's very much at the core of East Asian society today in a lot of ways. But it's this late Zhou period, which is also characterized by historians as the Warring States period. It's where the Zhou, who had always had a kind of decentralized political rule, they're not able to keep control. There's a rise in banditry, there's a rise in all sorts of corruption at the administrative level, and much of Chinese society seems like it's being undone. out of this chaos that Confucianism emerges, that of the Warring States period. It's abruptly ended in the 200s BCE under what's called the Qin Dynasty. Here's why the Qin Dynasty is going to be really significant. It's because it leaves two big hallmarks, the things most people think of when they think of Chinese civilization, and that is the accomplishments of Emperor Qin Shi Huang. Qin Shi Huang does two things. He builds what's called the Terracotta Army, which is one of the most impressive tombs you could imagine. It's analogous probably only to the pyramids of Egypt in a lot of ways, and some of the extreme resources that are directed there. It's an army of soldiers and chariots and administrators and all of the other things that would attend to the emperor that he has carved out of stone. Hundreds, thousands of individually carved soldiers to accompany him into the afterlife with all of the detailed features of specific individuals. And this is done with pretty modern technology. This carries him into the afterlife. I'm going to show you a clip on that, more on terracotta soldiers and army in a second. He also unifies the Chinese Empire. All of what was originally controlled by the Shang and the Zhou gets expanded under the Qin, although it's very brief. And he connects much of the Great Wall, the Great Wall probably being the biggest symbol that people think of when they think of Chinese civilization. Some of it had already existed that had been built during the Zhou dynasty, and I just want to point this out. This is not always clear. The Great Wall is really not one singular wall. It's a series of walls that occasionally got connected for various political and military purposes throughout time. Everything you see in yellow, that's stuff that goes back to the 5th, 4th, 3rd century BCE that was built to keep out invaders from the north and for various military purposes, and that's significant, but that's very old. Later stuff, especially the stuff we would recognize a lot from National Geographic and pop culture imagery, is going to be the stuff that's made in purple, and that's made largely under the Ming Dynasty in the 14, 15, 1600s CE. But there's been a real diversity of wall construction throughout Chinese history. But this gets back to the Qin Dynasty all the way back in the 3rd, 4th, and 2nd century BCE. So here's what I'm going to do. Last 5 minutes, we're going to watch a clip on the terracotta army and soldiers. Keep your notebooks out, because I want you to jot down 2 things, because this is going to be referenced at some later point. 2 things that stand out to you on the terracotta soldiers. Hang on one second.